Yes.
Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. We're going to be starting in a minute or two. Give a few more minutes for folks to show up and log in. I know it's been at least out here on the East Coast, it's a gorgeous day, and I imagine some people are probably wanting to be outside, but hopefully we'll make this entertaining and informative and worth your while, worth an hour of your day. The session's being recorded. We'll mention something about that in a minute. You're just logging in. We're about to start in about a half a minute or so. Well, I'd like to welcome you to the fourth webinar in this series entitled Challenges in Pediatric Neuroscience Research. My name is Adam Hartman. I'm a program director in the Division of Clinical Research at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, which is one of the institutes at the U.S. National Institutes of Health. I have a number of pediatric clinical trials and other human subject studies in my portfolio. I'm also a practicing child neurologist and epileptologist. We created this series to help investigators overcome some of the challenges that they might face in pediatric neuroscience in areas including neurology, neurosurgery, psychology, psychiatry, neurodevelopmental disabilities, physiatry, critical care, emergency medicine, pathology, radiology, and pharmacology, just to name a few, and there are many others. The ultimate goal is to improve the quality of care for our patients, but the more proximal goal is to enhance research that will facilitate improvements in practice. Our webinars are targeted to trainees, senior investigators, and even to those who are not currently involved in research, making the pie bigger, so to speak. We will be discussing the clinical trials networks in NINDS today. NINDS established these networks a number of years ago to concentrate expertise and streamline data coordinating center resources. The networks include pediatric hospitals, but the uptake in pediatrics has been lower than in adult neurology. We hope that today's webinar familiarizes everyone with our three legacy neurology clinical trials networks. Our guests today are Drs. Kodran Lungu, Jeremy Brown, and Scott Janis, all of whom are also program directors in the Division of Clinical Research at NINDS. All are very experienced and are great resources of information. First, a few technical notes about the webinar. This session is being recorded and will be available and transcribed and archived on the NINDS website. Details about where to find the archive version will be posted on social media and professional society listservs and newsletters. There will be a question and answer segment at the end. To ask a question of our presenters, you can either click on the ellipsis near the bottom of your screen and click on Q&A, or open the participant window and on the bottom right, find the Q&A area. To repeat, if you have questions for our presenters, please either click on the ellipsis near the bottom of your screen and click on Q&A, or open the participant window and on the bottom right, find the Q&A area. I will moderate the question period. Special thanks to Naomi Booker from NINDS for the technical support and coordination of the webinar, and the NINDS Office of the Scientific Liaison for all of its support and the publicity. Okay, let's get started. We will start with Dr. Kodran Lungu, who will discuss NeuroNEXT. Kodran, take it away.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Adam. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a program director in the Division of Clinical Research, and I serve as the science officer for the NeuroNEXT network. So this is probably the oldest of the three networks that we're going to talk today, although not the very first network that the Institute ran. The goal of this network, the full name being the Next Generation of Neurologic Treatments, is really to optimize the conduct of trials, focusing primarily in the phase 2 clinical trial space. The thinking behind this was that this is a critical stage of clinical development. And one of the main reasons for phase 3 trials not to work as we expect them to and not giving us results is often the fact that the previous steps, particularly at phase 2, had not been rigorous enough or not undertaken in the way that they should have been. So it is one reason for focusing a network on this space. The other goal was to really conduct trials a lot more efficiently. It's a big investment in time and resources as well as cost to stand up a network for the execution of multi-center clinical trials with every trial, with every project. So that's why we have these networks standing as a standing infrastructure to utilize and to funnel studies through it. So the stated goals at the time that the network was instated was to be more nimble, to respond quickly to opportunities arising in neuroscience clinical trials, to test promising new therapies, and to do so efficiently. So the network was established. Can we have the next slide? And it looks like this. It has a clinical coordinating center, which in this iteration resides in Mass General, a data coordinating center, which resides in Iowa, and 25 geographically distributed sites throughout the country. As you'll see from our map, we try to cover the entire country. We do have some large gaps, and we do keep this in mind when we establish the network. So the first criterion by far is obviously the strength of each applicant site in review, but we do try to keep in mind the distribution to have as good a coverage as we can, and we can improve on how we're doing on this, but we have reasonable coverage. And let's go to the next slide. The way this functions with a study that is funded is you have obviously the protocol PI, the study PI is the center point, and they work with the clinical coordinating center and the data coordinating center who oversee all the 25 clinical study sites. Now, not all sites are involved in every trial, but a good number of them typically are. And the network has a central IRB, a central pharmacy, central laboratory. So this use of centralized resources was in part pioneered by the NeuroNEXT network. The NINDS, our Division of Clinical Research, manages the network, and we organize the Data Safety and Monitoring Board, as well as a scientific advisory board for the entire network. And the network has a number of committees and groups and working groups that perform various functions. So let's go over the next slide. I'll give you a quick, brief overview of what the network has been doing so far. So it started in 2012. So far, 10 funded studies have gone through the network. There's another one about to be funded, so I'm not including it yet here. They are in various stages. Some are completed, some are ongoing right now, some are just starting up. And the efficient clinical trial infrastructure is managed by having a central IRB, and this was the first central IRB that NINDS used. We have master clinical trial agreements that harmonize the work among all the clinical sites. And we do try to make optimal use of common data elements and to standardize our work in the clinical trials as much as we can. The network does have as a goal and has managed to foster collaborations between public and private sector. We did have industry partnership, and we do have a small business track for conducting trials in the network, as well as studies coming from academic environment. And we did test promising new therapies, particularly in the form of drugs. So far in 6 of the 10 studies, that's been the main goal. Now let's go to the next slide, and I'll give you some examples of the metrics of how we're looking at what we have accomplished through this network. Again, the majority of the investigators have been academic, although one has come from the small business space. 3 significant industry partnerships within these studies, with more or less involvement of an industry partner, ranging from providing the drug to more involvement or funding part of the trial. And as I mentioned above, 6 have tested entirely new therapies in phase 2 trial. 2 studies have been focused primarily on pediatric populations. I'll elaborate a little bit on that, since I know that is of prime interest to this audience. A couple of time metrics, and we'll go over these, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Some of this may seem a little bit long, but when you compare it actually with similar trials, it's actually a fairly efficient way to move things forward. If we look from initial development to actual grant application, it's typically taken 10 months. I will show you what goes into this time. The time to receipt of funding from initial development is longer, but that is a bit deceiving because often the applications come in. It's very unusual for a study to get funded on the first application. So this means that the application goes back, the investigators might do additional work and then come back for a resubmission. So let's go to the next one, just so everybody understands what's involved here. One thing that a myth that I want to dispel, and I want to make sure that everybody understands this. An investigator does not have to be part of the NeuroNEXT network to submit an application. So the applications can come from inside the network. We're encouraging that, but the majority of applications actually come from outside the network. You do not have to be a site in the network to submit an application. The workflow is as follows. There's initial contact, typically with me and the wider team, and there's a draft synopsis. We gather additional information. So we have initial discussions. Sometimes it can be obvious that NeuroNEXT is not the best vehicle for the research that is being proposed, and then we try to help the applicant find a different path. We pull in subject matter experts from within NINDS or sometimes even from other institutes. Once we agree with the investigator that the application is indeed a good fit and there is a likelihood to succeed based on meeting some initial metrics of rigor, the application goes to the network executive committee where there is a review and just some feedback on how the application looks, and importantly, a feasibility review. In other words, the network sites and the network overall assesses whether they can conduct this study. Once that is the case, there is a draft budget put together and there is initial approval at high levels, at NINDS leadership levels to have the application come in. This is a quick sidebar. So every application above a certain amount at every institute needs approval to submit. So this is the way to prioritize high investments. And if that is approved, then the final application, the protocols and the budgets are finalized by the applicant working closely with the network. So that is a resource that the applicants have at this stage, and they finalize their application. And then this comes in and goes through the normal peer review process, like every other application. And once there is an award, if everything goes well, then study gets executed. And then on the other end, we work on result dissemination and move the data and samples to the repositories. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll give you some examples of metrics and achievements of the network. The timelines. It's very hard to compare, right? It's how do you compare a study that went through a network with another study that went in a different setting? But as far as we can tell, the second study that went to the network is a multiple sclerosis trial, and I'll give you some more details focused on progressive disease. The average enrollment was roughly twice as fast as in other, both NIH and industry-sponsored MS trials. The next study that went through, the Myasthenia Gravis, again, compared to a similar trial that was happening at the same time, we seem to be enrolling about twice as fast. Before the StrokeNET network, which you'll hear about later, came online, we were running stroke trials in NeuroNEXT as well. So the one stroke trial that went through completed enrollment on schedule, and it was actually, again, looking at the wider space, it seemed to be moving a little bit faster than typical stroke trials otherwise. So there is this efficiency. Means it's not the only thing that we're looking for. We're not looking at running the studies quickly, but this has been a major concern. Does it add additional time? And it really, at the very least, I would say that it doesn't necessarily make things move slower by deploying the network. So let's go to the next slide. Another specific example, which is probably a major contribution to science. So the first study that went through the network, actually this was designed at the same time as the network was being put in place. So they were kind of designed around each other. This was the Super Baby study, a spinal muscular atrophy study, looking at natural history, exploring biomarkers and their change over time and how they correlate with motor function. So it started in 2012, finished enrollment in 2013, and then the study went forward. The primary manuscript was published in 2017, And then a secondary manuscript came out later. This is a quote from an editorial that I think Stuart Radkov wrote in that issue of Annals when the first manuscript came out, kind of appreciating that NeuroNEXT is changing a little bit the way we can do trials in this phase 2 space and biomarker development space. So this is a very important link, right? Because some of the natural history data and some of the biomarker data, at least to some extent, has informed the development of therapies. And we know that this has been one of the major successes in neurology, where we have a disease-modifying therapy, several of them actually now, for spinal muscular atrophy. And then going to the next study, let's take the next slide, I'm sorry. The second study that went through, this was a multiple sclerosis trial that was Sprint MS. This was focused on progressive disease, and it was actually probably the first one that showed reliable evidence of an effect on disease progression. And it also established some brain atrophy measures as relevant markers of the disease. This was also our first industry collaboration that went very well. The little graph there shows the rate of enrollment, which was actually quite successful. And this is one of the studies that I used to show that, in fact, enrollment goes apparently slightly faster in the network than in similar settings. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going a little fast, but I'll be happy to answer any questions or clarify more things here. So, again, summarizing some of the contributions to the science, the first study, the spinal muscular atrophy study, was contributed some critical elements in our overall quest to solve a otherwise untreatable disease up to that point. The NN102, the MS trial, evaluated the therapy with a quantifiable impact on brain metrics in progressive multiple sclerosis, and this is actually undergoing further development. I haven't put it here, but I do want to talk just briefly about the other pediatric study. This was the FX-LEARN study. This was a study of Fragile X syndrome, looking at the effects of a new mGluR5 glutamate receptor allosteric modulator in conjunction with a language learning intervention in children with Fragile X syndrome. So this is a study that is now just ending in the network. And we've learned a lot about running pediatric trials through the network here. Another study that I will mention, NN105, this was a study evaluating a novel agent in treatment of irritability in Huntington's disease. So this was our first SBIR study. That stands for Small Business. Actually, I don't remember the whole acronym, but it's a vehicle for small business to be able to conduct the research through the network and to partner with us. And this actually was very successful because the result of the study was positive. The results have been announced, so the company has been able to move forward in the next stage of development. So that's been an achievement that we're happy with. So let's go to the next slide. So there's been a lot of key lessons here. Certainly, we learned that engagement and collaboration across disciplines is essential. So this is the one network of the three that you will hear that is somewhat disease agnostic, right? So we don't have a specific disease that we're focused on. If it's something that has to do with stroke, we do refer it to StrokeNET, or if it's urgent, it goes to SIREN. So you'll hear from Jeremy and Scott on those, but otherwise we essentially take all of neurology. And there are some clear efficiencies in the network model, but also some unique challenges. And in fact, the implementation of pediatric trials has actually been a challenge. And Adam has been working with us, and we've been trying to figure out how to do this better and how to engage the pediatric component of the network better so we can do more of it. And it's a little hard to evaluate efficiency. So I focused a lot on some that are quantifiable, like enrollment rates, but a lot of them are actually not easy to put some numbers on. So one big advantage here is what I like to call our captive brain power. So we have this structure in the network. It's a very easy place for us to go when we need consultation in something, or when we have an applicant who says, I'm struggling on how to develop this clinically. We have very clear opportunities to either play matchmaker to find researchers with the relevant interest, or to just assist in moving things forward by having these networks and having all the expertise in the networks. And yeah, I'm looking forward to answering questions and discussing a little bit more. It's a living project. We really change it all the time. We change the workflow and we change how we view the network and what we like it to focus on. And we actually take any feedback seriously, including any questions that you might have for us later. So I'll stop there so we stay on time, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Kodran. We'll be doing questions at the end. Our next speaker is Jeremy Brown, who's he's an emergency medicine physician, and he's one of our other program directors in the Division of Clinical Research at NINDS. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you, everybody. Naomi, am I running these slides, or are you doing it?
I will go ahead and do it. You can just let me know next slide.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking with you about the NIH SIREN network, which is a network that is jointly funded by two institutes. That's the Neurological Institute, where we're located, the National Institute for Neurological Disorders and Stroke, and the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute. Next slide, please. So this, just so that you know, was really the two previous networks that came together. You may have heard of these. One was the NET, the Neurological Emergency Treatment Trials Network, that was focused only on neurological emergencies, together with the Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium that was then focused really on cardiac emergencies and resuscitation, as well as some trauma. And we combined these two networks into a single network that that has as its mission to improve care of patients with emergency neurological or cardiothoracic problems, emergencies. Okay, if you can have the next slide, please. So what we try and do here is our aims are to really improve patient care by performing clinically important trials in emergency care. Emergency care here is really the care of the patient in the field, you know, when the ambulance gets there or even before then, all the way through to the emergency department and the end of that stay. We are a very collaborative network. I'll come back to that in just a moment. As Kodran mentioned, with his network, we're open to receiving inquiries and studies from people both inside the network and outside of the network. And we're going to try and transform emergency care research through these innovative trials, getting input from patients and other stakeholders as well. The next slide, please. So what we're focused on is obviously studies that are in the pre-hospital and emergency department setting. Now, currently we are doing a trial, two trials actually, in the ICU. They're of traumatic brain injury, and they involve procedures and interventions that are started in the ER. But we're really focused on early treatment, focusing on meaningful outcomes for patients. So we're not interested in does this lower the patient's white cell count by a certain amount. We're interested in what's you know, a meaningful outcome for the patients. We want them to be efficient, collaborative, and as I said, we're really trying to transform the way that we do clinical trials. Next slide, please. So the network consists of three parts, really. There's the Clinical Coordinating Center, which is run by Bill Barson and Rob Silverglide from Michigan. You can see at the top there, and Cliff Calloway from the University of Pittsburgh. They run the Clinical Coordinating Center, which manages the operations, puts together the executive meetings, and makes sure that the all working together, and that you know they're really the first people to talk to when you have an idea for a trial. Next slide, please. Together with them, we have a data coordinating center, not pictured here. They run the data. They take care of the very important, very tricky behind the scenes work that involves with getting approvals for trials and making sure that all the data is appropriately curated and of course running the data evaluations after the trial, and performing all the statistical analysis. And then the third part is the NIH leadership, which is the 6 folks here. I may have left somebody off, but that's myself, Carolina Mendoza-Puccini, and then colleagues from the NHLBI, as well as Robert Conwit from NINDS. Next slide, please. We have a fairly good spread across the United States, although as is fairly typical of studies, we're more on the east and west coast than we are in the middle of the country. But this slide here shows you where our hubs are. So we have, as well as the Clinical Coordinating Center and the Data Coordinating Center, we have clinical hubs. We have 11 of these hubs, and they're shown here with the blue dots. And each of those hubs is associated or affiliated with any number of spoke sites, typically between 4 and maybe 10. So you're looking at a network in total of at least 50 sites that is available to do the sort of the work on the ground and enrolling the patients in the clinical trials themselves. So 11 hubs, at least 4 spokes per hub, as well as a clinical coordinating center and a data coordinating center. If you could skip the next slide and then just go on to the one after that, I want to show you how you can get an idea for a study into this network. So there are really 2 parts that you, as a potential investigator with a clinical trial idea, can come to us. First is you can just call me up, email me, and say, hey, Jeremy, I've got this idea of a clinical trial. This is what I'm thinking. This is the clinical problem I'm seeing. This is why we need it. It's good when you have that initial chat to have an idea of what it is that you want to do, you know, in broad strokes, how many patients you think you'd need to enroll, and also a very rough idea of the amount of money that it would cost. So certainly trial ideas can come from anybody. So you could approach me, or some of you may know the leaders of the network professionally, and you could certainly talk to them first about it, or go to a PI from one of the 11 hubs. Either way, by the end of the day, we, if it comes to me at NIH or my colleagues in the Clinical Coordinating Center, we go through and look at all of the proposals from investigators, and most of the investigators are coming to us from outside the network, and that's exactly as it should be. And we will, of course, make sure that we think it's a good fit for the network, that it's something that's within our mission. So if you come to me, you know, with an idea to improve the care of patients with acute psychosis, that's a fantastic idea. It's terribly important, but may not be within the mission. It may not be of either of the institutes, or improve care of patients with femur fractures, for example. That's not within the mission of either of the 2 funding institutes. So you'll have to look at a different mechanism to do that. But we try and make sure that the proposal is within the mission of the SIREN network. Then we make sure that there is the willingness on the part of the institutes to fund it. Now, just so that you know, anybody can apply to the NIH for funding. You don't need anybody's permission. If you're going to submit a grant for more than $500,000 a year in direct costs, then all clinical trials are going to be significantly more than $500,000 a year in direct costs. You will need to get permission from the institute, and this is really so that the institutes can have an idea of the big ticket items that might be coming in and can appropriately budget for them. So you will need permission from either NHLBI or NINDS, and the processes at each are slightly different. But once you get that permission, then you can go ahead and submit your study for peer review at the NIH. So that's a review not by us as NIH employees, but by your peers, our peers, you know, academics and other people from the community, sometimes people from pharma, with expertise, and your protocol, your application will be given a score, and then if it gets good enough score, it will be funded, and the network will run your proposal, your trial. You, if you're the person who's come in with the study. You will be the PI, and you will be responsible for all the PI things that go along with that. But of course, the CCC and the DCC will be your equal partners, helping you to bring the study trial to fruition. And the CCC and DCC have years and years and years of experience in trials taking place in the emergency setting. So it's a really good idea to be involved with them, and that's how we would run your trial. Next slide, please. So again, this just talks about the potential sources. We've just discussed this. So if you go to the next slide, I want to talk to you about some of the studies that are currently being run within the trial, the SIREN network. Next slide, please. No. There should be some other slides. I'll keep going while nobody looks for those. We currently have a study looking at hyperbaric oxygen. Sorry, no, is that my? Looks like you've got the wrong set of slides.
Yeah, these are Scott's slides.
Yeah. Currently, SIREN is looking at a trial of hyperbaric oxygen in traumatic brain injury. We're looking at the utilization of brain oxygen monitoring in traumatic brain injury. And we've just started a trial which is going very quickly, actually, looking, it's called ICECAP, it's the influence of cooling duration. Basically, this study looks at patients who have had a cardiac arrest and who are brought into the emergency department unconscious or don't regain consciousness, usually because of anoxic brain damage. And we're studying the effect of cooling these patients. And I just learned that there is a twin study looking at cooling in children in a similar setting that has just gone through peer review and might end up becoming a network study as well. So that will be a pediatric version of ICECAP called PD ICECAP. In addition, we have studies looking at the ketogenic diet for status epilepticus and other studies as well that we are that are in the pipeline. So we have a very, very busy network. In addition, the network also ran a study looking at convalescent plasma in patients who have COVID. This was an outpatient trial, and the study was stopped fairly recently, actually, just like about a week ago. It was stopped when we realized that there was that the two arms of the trial, the intervention arm giving patients convalescent plasma in the ED and then sending them home, compared to the placebo arm, there was no likelihood of there being a significant difference, and the trial was stopped about a week ago. But here you see that the network also was involved with COVID research. Finally, I just want to bring your attention on the last slide to a study that was done not by the SIREN network, but by its predecessor, and Scott Janus was very instrumental with this. It was Robin Conwit. This was the Rampart trial looking to compare two anti-epileptics to benzos for the treatment of pre-hospital status epilepticus, and it was run through the NET trial, the network, the Neurological Emergency Treatment Trials Network. A very successful trial, managed to enroll several hundred patients with many, many different emergency medicine, EMTs and EMS agencies. And actually, fairly recently, that trial, which showed that there was no difference in the two arms of the trial, resulted in a new indication being approved with the FDA for the treatment of seizures, as well as a new device to inject midazolam being approved by the FDA. So there's a way in which you can see a trial comes all the way through an NINDS research network, enrolls the patients, including patients using these exemption from informed consent studies, which are challenging to do, but of course must be done properly and ethically, all the way through to the results being published in the New England Journal and leading to a change in the drugs that are available, as well as new ways of actually providing them to the patients. I will take questions at the end, and I'll hand it back now to Adam. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. That was fantastic. Great introduction to SIREN, the newest member of the networks. And so our next speaker is Dr. Scott Janus, who's going to be, Scott's been a NINDS Forever, and he's going to be talking about StrokeNET. Scott, take it away.
Very good. Thanks, Adam. So again, I'm Scott Janis. I've been at NINDS Forever, as Adam indicated. I'm going to talk a bit about StrokeNET. One of the benefits of going third is that there is a bit of overlap in the structure. So I will try not to focus so much on how we mirror, but I will try and focus on how we differ. StrokeNET is a bit different in respect to the other networks in that it is a disease-focused network, unlike the previous two that you heard about, and it is also the largest of these three, and I'm going to show you that in a second. So if you go to the next slide for me, I guess I could start with sort of why we have a disease-focused network. And of course, there's a lot of public health reasons why we would want to study stroke, but outside of the fact that it's kind of a birth to death kind of disease, we also spend a lot of money within NINDS. It's one of our larger clinical programs that we focus on. We've been doing clinical trials in stroke for probably 30 or 40 years. I haven't been here that long, but I've been here for a lot of them. But that I think gives us the thought. Now we've had, unlike I think the previous two networks that you had going into this network, we had a lot of experience doing clinical trials in stroke. So that made us think a little bit how and why we wanted to move into a specific network that we ran for stroke. So if you go to the next slide, I'm just going to kind of gloss this because I wanted you to understand. If you could advance to the next slide for me, thanks. Just to understand a little bit where the network's coming from, we have an opportunity because of its size to really try and be a leading platform for stroke trials in stroke, but not just nationally, we also interact globally. And I'll try and come back to that a little bit later on. But because we focus on one disease, it gives us the opportunity to really try and drive home different strategies to reduce the burden. And that, of course, fits within our NINDS goals. So if you go to the next slide, this is kind of how we landed here. So back in 2012, NINDS held a strategic stroke planning meeting. This is something that NINDS had been doing for a number of years. We had a stroke progress review group that was really birthed after we did the TPA trials. And we've updated and evaluated our program. Back in 2012, we took a somewhat unique approach to planning our priorities, and we divided our field into sort of these three main areas, being treatment, prevention, and recovery. And we pressed those areas to try and drive down what priorities we should focus on as a network. And one of the thematic messages that we came across was that it'd be beneficial to have, of course, networks to support each one of these areas. And we saw an advantage to having a single network that covers this gamut of prevention to recovery. And so that really is sort of how we got focused here. Now, one of the things that makes Stroke Network a bit unique in the respect, if you go to the next slide for me, from the other two networks is that because we are so focused, we do have our own sort of internal policy that any stroke trial that needs multiple centers to be conducted that comes into NINDS is going to go through our network. So it's not just a selective thing, it's actually a driven thing. And one of the reasons, and again, I'll hit on this as we go along, but it does give us the ability to really prioritize and think about the questions that we're focusing our program on and trying to answer, and how we can collaborate, again, with this broader community. So as I mentioned, following that 2012 planning effort, we were rapidly able to move into constructing the network. As Jeremy mentioned, I was also part of setting up NET. We had a lot of history already in how to set up a network. That, of course, that history led into NeuroNEXT. And so we just kind of built off that same platform. We were rapidly able to review and fund this program that we sort of officially kicked off in 2013. So we've been operating about 7 years in. Right now, we are a very large program. We have 27 regional centers, and I'll come back to the differences on this here in a few slides. But these are the regional coordinating centers that really help us manage the large number of stroke centers that we have across the United States. And I use the number 500 plus. That number fluctuates, But really what we're talking about is stroke hospitals across the US that collaborate with these regional centers that we fund that then are operationally controlled by a data coordinating center and a clinical coordinating center. Our clinical center is in Cincinnati, and our data center is at MUSC, which is the same data center that SIREN is using. Another thing, again, that I wanted to kind of focus on that makes us a little bit different is that we're not just doing phase 2 trials like NeuroNEXT, phase 3 trials, which I think SIREN has focused on a lot, although they're now starting to do phase 2. We have a network set up so that we can do both early phase to late phase clinical trials, and you'll see that we have quite a bit portfolio. We've also built into our program that we have the ability to do biomarker studies that are advanced to the state of validation. So it gives us the opportunity to add in a little bit more science, but it largely focuses on phase 2 and phase 3 trials. And then we, again, focus in this treatment, prevention, and recovery. The other thing I'll just kind of quickly say about this map is that you're probably looking at the map and you're going, oh, you have the same centers that you do in SIREN and in NeuroNEXT. And it kind of looks that way in a lot. There are a number of academic centers that concentrate along the coastlines that I think is very natural for us to build upon. What this map doesn't actually show you is the 500 centers that really populate the United States. We actually have, I think, a center that's about within an hour drive of any population in the United States. So it's pretty diverse in our ability to get a broad population of patients. If you can go to the next slide for me. One of the things I just kind of wanted to, again, hone in a little bit is everything I have sort of on the top is everything you've heard with our network vision, increasing efficiency. For StrokeNET, we are trying to prioritize our phase 3, phase 2 trials across prevention, treatment, and recovery. The ability of having stable infrastructure. Again, I mentioned that one of the things that makes us also unique is that we are partnering. We have an international program called GAINS that is collectively interacting with stroke networks across the globe. And we have partners from India to Japan through the UK and Europe and so forth. And so it's actually an interesting project that we're trying to partner across the globe to manage large international trials. The other thing that StrokeNET had to do is we had to consider, since we're a disease-focused network, how we would manage enrollment of patients that could theoretically go in multiple trials. And we have this issue because we can enroll patients in an acute trial that may take them out of a recovery trial. Then, of course, we have acute patients that with ischemic stroke that might be eligible for multiple trials. So this is one of the things that having a network structure has really allowed us to do, because we can very carefully look at how the trials interact even before they come into the network and try and develop plans so that we can ensure that we can enroll in all of our trials. And this is something that's important because stroke trials by nature are very difficult to do. And then the last thing that I will sort of mention that is an overarching vision of our network, and I think the others as well, is that we're trying to train the field in stroke so that this legacy of what we're doing now will carry into the future. We're really, in stroke, we're trying to transform much the same the way the model of heart disease and cancer and so forth is done. We're trying to ensure that legacy moves forward. Having a large network also gives us, I think, an advantage that, for trials that we do, we're actually training these sites because many of them are not as research advanced as our regional coordinating center. So by doing the research, they're actually incorporating some of the information that we're learning in the trial. So this training aspect is huge for us in thinking how to go forward. So if you go to the next slide, the last thing I'll sort of mention in terms of how we came to be the stroke network was we had to really think about all the territories of the various different disciplines that are going to touch stroke patients. Everything from the front end to the back end, including pediatrics, which I know this meeting is really sort of focused on. But when we constructed the network, we thought very carefully in the way that we wrote the funding announcements so that centers had to come in with partnerships already developed. They had to show us that they had collaborative connections with, not only the neurosurgery or the recovery aspect, the interventional aspect, the pediatric aspect. And so all of these teams had to get built in so that we had the ability to do these various trials. And that's something we continue to build upon, but it's become sort of fundamental in how we've been thinking going forward. So if you'd go to the next slide for me. One of the things I just wanted to mention, again, this looks very similar to the last two talks that you heard in our networks, but one of the things that we had to do in StrokeNET to really sort of cover this territory was we developed various working groups and advisory committees that allowed us to sort of focus in. So we do have working groups in acute stroke and prevention and recovery and rehab that really work with our trial applicants up front, and they also work with our trials as they're ongoing, lending the collaborative network experience to the whole game. So it's a learning model and respect that each time they get presented with new ideas, it gets incorporated into that memory machine. The advisory committees, and you'll notice I highlighted that we do actually have a pediatric advisory committee in the network because it was always our vision that we would be able to do pediatric trials. This is an area that historically before the network was very difficult for NINDS, so it's been one of our targets overall. And what we've done is our pediatric advisory committee actually participates in our working groups. So there's always a member that represents that community that's listening to all the proposals. So in a way, if we have the opportunity to expand the population, we would want to take advantage of that early on. So if you go to the next slide for me, I'm just going to end with the last couple of slides just to show you what we've been up to and talk a little bit about how things come into StrokeNET. But as you can see, we've had a very healthy portfolio of studies that we've been doing. Now, StrokeNET, because I mentioned, we sort of started in the middle of everything that we were doing. We actually incorporated a couple of studies that were not funded as part of the network, but the network participated in. A couple of these trials that are in black on my slide, like MISTY-3 and IDEF. These were trials that were actually awarded about the same time the StrokeNET was awarded. So the infrastructure was outside of the Stroke Network, but we built a collaboration right off the bat so that the Stroke Network could get involved. That also helped our dead time as we were building, from scratch as a network. But we have a couple of trials that are done under our belt, Diffuse-3 being the first fully fledged StrokeNET trial and really kind of changed the landscape for endovascular therapy in the late window. That was an exciting trial to finish. We have a number of ongoing studies now. I think we're up to 13 with 2 new ones coming in. I've highlighted, we have one pediatric study. I'm very excited to have that. It's a recovery study, really looking at an intensive rehabilitation program in babies who are born with stroke. But this has really kind of paved our way. That study is doing really, really well, despite the challenges that we've had over the last year with COVID. I think they've really kind of set the bar for how we can do pediatrics trials in the network. And we do have other ideas. I'm going to show you that in a second. But it is exciting to have something that covers the gamut. As you'll notice, some of our trials are very, very large, and that's in part because we have some large phase 3 trials, upwards of 3,000 patients. So you can see why we need such a large infrastructure to conduct. But there is, as there's overlap in some of these trials, there's certainly, I think, enough differences that we can run these trials simultaneously without impacting enrollment too badly in some of the other ones. And it gives us a lot of room to grow. I think the limitation for us really has to be if the trial fully overlaps with the activity that we have, and it's such an ability that we wouldn't be able to do it simultaneously. We may have to put it in the parking lot and come back to it when the time is right. So if you go to my next slide, one of the things I really wanted to kind of leave as a visual impression for you as far as StrokeNET is concerned is that we've been able to balance these trials across these 3 areas, which is one of the prime goals of the network. But the other thing I wanted you to see is that for those interested in recovery or in treatment or prevention, we've found creative ways now to build in multiple questions. So trials like Sleep Smart, that's an adult sleep study. We have a recovery question and a prevention question built into the trial. So it's really going to answer 2 questions at the same time. We have another trial that just came in that really covers the space between recovery and treatment called Verify. So I think this is an exciting way of trying to use the infrastructure to ask more questions than we were otherwise limited to do. So if you move to the next slide, this pathway is identical to the pathway that you heard into the other two networks. One of the things that I will say that we do is that we engage the network early on. So applicants come to us with ideas, and then we hook them up with one of our working groups so that they almost get kind of a mock peer review ahead of even writing an application. And I think a lot of our investigators, especially our young investigators, have learned quite a bit about their project as they get really national kind of input on what they're doing. There's no directive by StrokeNET to pick what we're going to do. That's really left up to NIH to decide. But the network has really been there to try and help foster the idea and hopefully get it funded. As the other networks do, we go through a very intense feasibility review so that we can really give the applicants or the applications as much information to hopefully make them more successful going through peer review and council review. And actually, the back end of that, of course, is the network remains very engaged in the final development of the protocol to be able to conduct the study. So a lot of interaction with the applicants is something that with our networks we weren't able to do as much of before, but I think it's an exciting learning process. I've got one more slide that I'll go to. You can go to the last slide for me, just to kind of again show you where we're at in the broader space. We've had a lot of ideas in stroke that have come to us, pretty distributed across our areas. I mentioned that one of our pediatric studies, as I mentioned, has been funded, but we do have a couple other ones that we're working on. I hope to see those go forward. It's not a huge population of patients, but it's certainly a key area that we were focusing on, and I think we've been successful in trying to draw some of that attention. The other thing that I'll say from I think our network, and I think this is true of the other two networks because we deal with a different pool, our success rate is actually significantly higher than if you look at sort of the general R01 pool. I think right now, just to submit an R01, you have about a 10 or 11% chance of getting funded. Studies that go through our network, we're closer to 20-25% in the grand sphere. Some of these applications, as was mentioned earlier by Kodrin, Jeremy, have to go back through re-review because they have to work out details. But that being said, when you just look at the number of ideas, we've actually had 2 studies that have gotten through on their first try, which is pretty impressive when you consider the complexity of a clinical trial review. So I will end on that slide. My very, very last slide is just a contact slide that I put up, and I think that information, if you have questions specifically for the network, you can reach out to one of these websites. So I'll end there, Adam, and maybe go into the group chat.
Thanks a million, Scott. That's great. So we only have a few minutes left, but we'll start a brief Q&A period. So as a reminder, if you want to ask a question of our presenters, you can either click on the ellipsis near the bottom of your screen and click on Q&A, or open the participant window on the right side, and on the bottom right, find the Q&A area. I'll go ahead and ask the first question. And that is going to be a question for all 3 of you. And that is, so Scott just told us who you should contact for StrokeNET. Kodrin and Jeremy, do you want to tell everybody what how to contact you, how the process kind of works very briefly for getting things started?
Sure. So this is Jeremy. So if you have an idea, best thing to do is to write it down on one sheet of paper, what your idea is, why you think it's important, what the study would involve, how many patients you think you're going to need to enroll, and the rough idea of the cost. You don't have to have the cost clear, but with that, you can just send me an email at jeremy.brown@nih.gov, and I'm a good place to start for any of the discussions about studies that you want to bring into SIREN.
Thanks, Jeremy. Kodrin?
For NeuroNEXT, I'm the main line of contact, so my email is actually listed on the NeuroNEXT website as well. And I am the advantage of having an unusual name is that if you Google, I'm going to be the one that pops up with this name. So just send me an email with the inquiries. On the NeuroNEXT website, there is also a link for the applicants to a draft synopsis form. So that is a form that just asks for the basics, title of your study, what you're trying to accomplish. And there are some key questions there, including what do you have in mind, what makes this a phase 2, and what would the phase 3 look like, since we're focused on phase 2. So there are a number of things that make any initial conversation much, much more efficient. So I always encourage, you can email me anyway, of course, but for the initial conversation, if you go through that synopsis form, it just makes me and my colleagues, puts us in a much better position to help you a lot more efficiently on the initial call. But yes, the short answer is just write to me, and if I'm not the right person, or if this sounds like it's not NeuroNEXT, I can direct you.
Great, thank you. So one question that we'll cover briefly, for early stage investigators, are there ways to gain increased experience in clinical trials within your networks? Kodran, did you want to start with that one?
Yeah, so we actually have fellowships. So each NeuroNEXT sites, they have fellowship slots that are attached partially to the NeuroNEXT site. So that's a wonderful opportunity. Also, I didn't get a chance to mention, but now kind of rolled into the entire NeuroNEXT infrastructure is our clinical trials methodology course. So my colleague Robin Conway runs that from our end. And that is a fantastic, so I've been through that, several of us actually at NINDS back when we were fellows or junior faculty, we went through it. And it's a wonderful opportunity to kind of train towards becoming a clinician scientist and a trialist. So there are a number of opportunities. We're always happy to direct you to them if you have trouble finding them.
Thanks. So one last question in the interest of time, and the question is, can the networks be utilized by industry sponsors? Scott, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, so the short answer is there is the opportunity for us to interact with industry, mostly through the small business program. The main way that I think we've interacted with industry partners is through our academic investigators. I think just about every stroke trial, or nearly every stroke trial that we have, has some partnership with industry. They're usually in-kind donations supporting some aspect of the trial that becomes part of the application. We unfortunately don't have a model in which we can borrow our network or lend our network to do industry trials, because any idea that the government funds has to be reviewed and approved by the federal government. So it creates some logistics in that respect, but we do have many different pathways in which we can partner with, or in some cases fund directly to, depending on what their financial structures are. And we can talk about that, offline if there are specific questions anybody has.
Great, thank you. And then a question for you, Jeremy, and that is, if a trial could be supported by more than one network, who decides? Is it the investigator or the network? Which network is the best fit?
That's a great question. So I'm sure many of the pediatricians on the call are aware of the PCAR network that is funded by HRSA, the Pediatric Critical Care Network, which I think of as the SIREN network for children, or you can think of SIREN as the PCAR network for adults. So if it's really a trial that is predominantly a condition that is found in children, or is going to need to be focused on children, you could run it through the PCAR network, or it could be run as a SIREN study. As I said, the study of cooling of children who've had cardiac injury is likely to be run through SIREN. So it's really a question of talking to the PIs and the leadership of each of the networks, and we'll all come to some kind of mutual understanding about where the study stands, the best likelihood of being successful.
We just add to that it's not an unusual situation at all for us several of us, at least from the networks that we run, to get on a call with an applicant, because sometimes it's not clear at all. And we've had calls where we all get together and try to figure out together with the applicant where something fits best.
Right, but I would add just one more layer to that, because we built our networks to actually engage and interact between one another. So we do have, in some cases where a stroke trial would be run through StrokeNET, It does cross sometimes into space where we have to partner with, say, SIREN, and try and be able to conduct with their help as well. So we would think of it in that way too.
Right. So back pre-COVID, we used to say, our offices are literally right next to each other, but that's not the case now. Now I guess everybody's just a Zoom call away. So I wanted to thank all of our presenters. It was really fantastic. The session, as I mentioned earlier, is recorded and will be transcribed and archived on the NINDS website with our other webinars. It'll be in the coming week or so, and details about where to find the archive versions will be posted on social media and professional society listservs and newsletters. So with that, I wanted to really thank everyone. Thanks to our participants. Thanks to everyone who attended, and have a great rest of your week. Thanks again.